I'm Mathias Guenther. I'm from. I'm a German Canadian. I was born in Germany. Well, it was at the time when I was born in 1942. Uh, uh, it was part of Germany. Now it's part of Poland. I was born in Danzig, Gdansk, now, and we left what was then Prussia during the war, and then tried to settle in West Germany for a number of years, where I went to school right up to early high school, and then we emigrated to Canada in 1956. So I've had the immigrant experience and the bit of the diaspora experience that a number of us in anthropology write about now. And in fact, I think leaving, actually my grandparents, where we were originally from, lived in Galicia, which was a multicultural region where there were Germans, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Hungarians, and we left that area, came to West Germany, and then had the immigrant experience here in '56. I went to high school in Toronto, and that sort of was during my formative years. I struggled with English. I tried the new school, new friends, and also the process of integrating into a new culture, new society, a new community is something that I experienced very consciously and had difficulties, but eventually I now feel really this is my home. Although I still have contact with Germany. I spent 3 terms as visiting professor at different universities in Frankfurt, Mainz, and Marburg, and I kept my German, and I read the German literature and anthropology, which I find fascinating, and I'll get to that sometime later, I think. Now, the University of Toronto, after high school, after graduating from high school in 1961, I took a year off and did a kind of bumming around Europe trip, hitchhiking through Europe with a friend, and spent quite a bit of time because I had no money. During the winter, we went to Spain and Italy and spent some time there, acquired a kind of working language. At that time, there in the early 60s, there was, in Spain, for example, that was still under Franco, there was very little English spoken. So anyway, this kind of honed me, again, my interest in other cultures, my interest in travel, partly through the immigrant experience and partly through that very interesting year of hitchhiking through Europe. Made me decide, when I was ready to go to university, to take anthropology. It wasn't the obvious choice, because I had other interests as well, in literature, for example. I was very interested in zoology, because that had been a childhood interest. I always had animals and interested in animals and nature. And so, in fact, I wanted to study zoology, but my math subjects in high school were not high enough to allow me to enroll, to take the zoology program. So I decided to go into anthropology. My idea then was ultimately to get back to animals via primatology. I was very interested in primatology as one part of my anthropology training. But equally, I was interested in the humanistic side of anthropology. In fact, the anthropology, when I started at U of T in 1962, the umbrella program that it was under was called SOC and Phil, Sociology and Philosophy. So it was a program that was very much, First of all, the program itself was a four fields program at U of T at that time. So physical anthropology, prehistory archaeology, linguistics, and cultural social anthropology. But then part of that being part of the SOC and Phil program, other humanities. The undergraduates were encouraged to take courses outside anthropology as well, which I did. I did a lot of philosophy, sociology, psychology, history, literature, which, in fact, especially German literature, which I almost did for my MA. When a choice came to do a master's degree, I was torn between the two. But I stayed with anthropology. Now, because what I really liked then and still do like about our discipline is its holistic, its wide scope, you know. This is something that appealed to me right from the start. And my first, the intro anthro instructor that I had, Robert Daly, he's since passed away in 1999. He died he went to the States and died there. Well, he was very much a Renaissance man. In fact, in his obituary, he was referred to as such. And he taught anthropology in that way by not only the four fields, but he made reference to literature, to philosophy. I remember he mentioned Théâtre de Chardin, for example, whom I myself was interested in at the time, and we had some conversation about that in his office. So he really inspired me, and I think so many students, undergraduate students, are inspired and drawn into the field or decide to stay in anthropology through their introduction to it, through their introductory professor. And this is why when I taught later, years later, I really enjoyed the intro course and put a lot of work into it, because I think it's an important course assignment, course responsibility for an anthropology professor. But more about that later, possibly. Now, I did my honors BA in '66. I finished that, and then I went on to right away to a course MA. At that time, U of T had course MAs, master's degrees, where you didn't have to do a thesis. It was just based on graduate courses, and I did that in 1 year. And then the decision came up on what to do for my PhD. Initially, I was going to go to do a PhD, my fieldwork in Northern Ontario amongst the Ojibwe people. I was going to do that. One of my mentors in my MA year was Dunning, Robert Dunning. I forget his first name. Richard Dunning? Richard, yeah. Anyway, and in my MA and first PhD year, I was actually his research assistant and did some field work during the summer months, the 2 summers at Moraviantown in Southern Ontario, Delaware, First Nations community. And it was a fairly, I would now say boring, but at the time, well, I found it boring even then, a study on the relationship between kinship and residence. Good old British anthropology stuff that Dunning was interested in. And anyway, so that was my first exposure to fieldwork in a Southern Ontario First Nations community. And I thought, I was very interested through having met Rogers, Edward Rogers, who did work amongst the Ojibwe at Round Lake. And I had him in one of my graduate courses and thought that his work was interesting. I was going to do something in Northern Ontario and prepared for that, including taking Ojibwe courses as extracurricular. But then I met another mentor, Peter Karstens, who recently died, And he is from University of Cape Town. He had recently been hired from University of Cape Town, and he had done work amongst a Nama-speaking community of Buster people in the Northwestern Cape. And I had him as a professor in one of my graduate courses on theory, anthropological theory, and he also spoke Nama, the click language, that I found intriguing. I was very interested in the Bushmen already at that point because I had read the recently published book, The Harmless People, which I enjoyed, which was a course assignment actually when I was an undergraduate. And then I also had seen this John Marshall's film that was recent, The Hunters, the protracted giraffe hunt, and I thought that was fascinating. And then he mentioned to me, when I was still thinking about Northern Ontario, he said, "Well, why don't you go to the Bushmen? Why don't you go to the Kalahari?" I said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" And well, I thought about it, and then I decided to do just that on the spur of the moment. So I changed my PhD plan fairly late in the game. In fact, it was already after I did the comprehensive, So I had to put together a research proposal, a PhD proposal, which I did with the help of Richard Lee. Richard Lee was then in the field in Dobe, in northwestern Botswana, working on finishing his PhD, and I wrote to him in the field, and he is actually a U of T student too. That's where he did his undergraduate years, and I met him briefly because he was, when I did my PhD residence year, he was on campus to give a talk, slide lecture on his work amongst the Jumkwasi at Dobe. And so I got to know him, and he said, "Yeah, why don't you come and do your work in the Kalahari?" And the work I wanted to do was at that time there was quite a bit happening in the Kalahari amongst the Bushmen, or now they called San. I'll talk about that later as to why I now really have switched to San, but I still talking about the past now. The term Bushman was still au courant, and so I'm using it now because I'm talking about the past. Anyway, the Marshall team had been Lorna Marshall and Elizabeth and John Marshall had worked in Nainai on traditional hunting-gathering bushmen, Kron bushmen. Then Richard Lee, the Dobe project, to which a number of other people came, the so-called Harvard group, right? Megan Beasley, John Yellen, and Henry Harpending, and a number of others. So they did traditional hunting-gathering bushmen there, and then there was the Japanese team in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, Hiro Tanaka and Sugawara and others. And then there was a South African team that did traditional bushmen, Philip Tobias and Heinz. So I thought, this is a fairly well-covered field, what should I do? And I thought I'd do something none of these people did on social and cultural change of bushmen. So I was looking for a community where I could, a bushman community where I could do that, and this is why I wrote to Richard Lee, was in the field, and he suggested I should go to Dekar in the Khansi district in western Botswana, where there was a recently established Dutch Reformed Church mission station, which was run by the Dutch Reformed Church. There was a black evangelist and a Boer farmer and they tried to bring Christianity to the Bushmen. And I wanted to study specifically the influence of Christianity, the interaction of these two religious systems, Christianity and what I didn't know at the time, very little had been done on Bushman religion. And I wanted to study Bushman religion, the interaction of the two religions. And then along with that, I wanted to do also a general, what we then called acculturation, a study of sociocultural change of the what were called the farm Bushmen, as opposed to the Felt Bushmen. The Felt Bushmen were the hunter-gatherers who lived in the pre-industrial, pre-agricultural hunting-gathering, foraging mode, and then these recently settled farm laborers who worked on ranches, cattle ranches that the Boers had set up at the turn of the previous century in the 1890s. So that's why I decided to go there, and that's where I did my field work. But I think we're talking about the field work later. I'll get to that later. I'll just, at the moment, talk a bit about my supervision of the PhD thesis, because that's something that, in my case, was interesting, because I had not one, not two, but three PhD supervisors, which, well, for one thing, my fieldwork ran almost 2 years, so it was a protracted period. And then on top of that was the write-up of the thesis. So that was, on the part of a supervisor, quite a time commitment, at least 3 years. So, well, I started with my first supervisor, who supervised me when I was in the field, was Shuji Nagata, who at U of T, who died a year or so ago. And he is I had him as he taught anthropology religion, and I had a graduate course from him in that field, which has always interested me. And he was interested in my topic of the religious change and Bushman religion and religious acculturation, as it were. He also had a philosophical bent which appealed to me, humanistic bent. And he was the guy who kind of introduced the department back then to structuralism. Maybe I can talk about that later, because the U of T, University of Toronto department was very much a four-field, half of them Boasian American anthropologists, the other British structuralist anthropologists. So structuralism was relatively new, and Nagata brought that to the department. So I started with him, and that was my sort of paradigm that guided my work when I was in the field. But then when I came back in 1970, well, he left to do field work on a sabbatical in Malaysia. So I was then assigned another supervisor, Peter Carstens, who is very much a sort of British social anthropologist, very sociological in his focus, and very so a new theoretical framework kind of shaped what my write-up, when I came home from the field. Well, then he had to leave on sabbatical, so Richard Lee, a new hire, came to the department. He had just finished his PhD, and then he took over. So I was introduced to yet another paradigm of cultural materialism, cultural ecology, and that led to revisions in the thesis again, which explained why the thesis took a long time. But it was also exhilarating because it introduced me to the three paradigms and forced me to kind of work my thesis along these various theoretical perspectives, and it broadened everything. And in fact, in the years following, once I finished the PhD, in my early scholarly career, I benefited from this multi-paradigmatic training that I was sort of forced on me during my PhD write-up, because a lot of my early writings, and we'll talk about them later, are all, in German they say, quer durch den Garten, crisscross through the garden. You know, a flower, each flower is sampled, each vegetable is tasted. So I wrote papers on cultural ecology, on social organization, on political organization, on a lot on ethnohistory. That was a fairly recent interest. On material culture, a lot on social organization, especially the structure of band society, the three-tiered structure, and which I'll talk about again later in a different context, and then of course religion, even stuff, although that language. There was a couple of papers I did that had to do, albeit peripherally, with language, and especially the use of metaphorical language that is very prominent in storytelling. So I became very much an eclectic anthropologist, which was fine, because to me this is one of the strengths and what initially attracted me to anthropology. It's Renaissance scope, you know, looking at the human condition from the physical, evolutionary side, the social side, the cultural, intellectual, the imagination, and all that with vast time spans, you know, back to eons ago and right to the present, and then in historical periods in between. So, and it was, that was the PhD experience. And a question that I was asked to think about is the authors in anthropology that inspired me most at the time. Well, it was, at the time, I wasn't overly inspired by any one in particular. I think that's partly because the undergraduate and graduate experience had always been eclectic. So I sampled everything. I liked whatever theorist I liked, I enjoyed and was turned on. I would probably say the people that I was most interested in during my graduate studies was Victor Turner. And I, in fact, used some of his work, some of his concepts, anti-structure, communitas. And then the Manchester School generally, Max Gluckman. I like especially his work on conflict and cross-cutting loyalties and the balance between conflict and structure stability. I also liked the alternate styles of rationality debate, Evans-Pritchard, you know, the Azande witchcraft, and Robin Horton. Those were the things that I liked. And then I was introduced to structuralism when Nagata gave this lecture to, there was a general lecture in the department, it was I think in 1965, where everyone was assembled and Nagata talked about Lévi-Strauss and this structuralism, and that caused quite a buzz in the department. And a lot of people read Lévi-Strauss, and I myself included, and was very inspired by that. So those were the sort of formative influences in my graduate years, and then I went to the field and did my field work amongst the narrow bushmen of Khansi district of Botswana.